Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on current events in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy investment and policy.
Thanks. Glad to be back. So we're recording this on March 20th, 2022.
As the war in the Ukraine approaches its fourth week, we remain inspired by the courage and sacrifice of the Ukrainian people as they fight for their families, their country, and the right to self-determination. This week, we take a step back from the day-to-day events to focus on the strategic decisions that are reshaping the economic and political world in profound ways over the last month. First, we look back and consider the origins of the crisis and ask our first guest on the podcast, Professor Shahin Berenji from Southern Methodist University, how much weight should be given to the idea that NATO expansion in itself is the root cause of the conflict. And along these lines, does Russia have legitimate security concerns by having NATO members on its borders? Next, we discuss the greater implications of the unprecedented sanctions regime imposed by the West, namely its growing impact on the global economy, the vulnerability of the developing world to these impacts, and the likely lessons being taken away from adversarial regimes. Finally, we wrap up by exploring how unified the world really is in its opposition to Russia's war. So, before we get to all of this, how was your week? Ryan, you've been gone a lot this week, so I feel like we might actually have banter.
We might actually have banter because I've been gone most of the week. Yeah, I mean, I had took a work trip to Houston, which is good. I haven't been to Houston, the oil capital of the world, in quite some time, almost like 10 years. Hadn't changed any. I mean, the traffic, I swear, Houston, you guys, you are the craziest, nuttiest drivers. That was terrifying. Going in at 7 o'clock at night on the, is it the 610? People going 70 miles an hour on a 7-lane road without any turn signals.
It's funny when I say that because everyone thinks people are crazier in Los Angeles.
No, you can't. We can't get up to the speeds in LA. That's the key. And they actually use turn signals in LA, I find. They're actually not
occasionally
too bad. Houston, never. No turn signals.
For me, it was always the people on the highway who just go across 6 lanes and they don't care if you're there. Like, they don't have any respect for any of the cars around them. So you have to slam on your brakes and notice that this, car is zooming across the 6 lanes so they can get off the exit.
Yeah. Yeah. And stuff isn't quite as regulated. Like, it's a thing in Houston to have, there's gigantic spools where they kind of spool kind of big industrial lines or pipe or things like that. But so these big spools regularly fall off in Houston into the middle of the highway. So it's like a whole thing on YouTube and
really?
Reddit. Yeah, where they just kind of roll and people have to dodge them as they come off. So Houston's a little nuts driving around, but no, it was a good visit.
I can't believe it's been 10 years since you've been there.
Well, yeah, I just didn't go that often. It was primarily based in Long Beach, not really a reason to travel to Houston. So, yeah.
Well, that sounds fairly interesting.
Yeah, no, it was good. And then, unfortunately, we had a death in the family. My uncle passed away, so it was real tough on the family. But, had to travel then down to North Carolina, which is good seeing everybody. And it was good because, I had never taken a train down. I mean, when you lived in Albany, New York, we would occasionally park in one of the villages along the Hudson and take the train. But that's like a little commuter train. So this is an Amtrak train from Washington, D.C. down to Raleigh. And it was actually and it was very crowded, and almost everybody mentioned, which kind of ties into some of our discussions, but just with gas prices being so high, it made as much sense. It was basically the same. You either fill up your tank to make that drive, or you kind of sit for 6 hours. I mean, these are slow trains. They're not European or Japanese trains. But, it was pretty good. It was a good experience. It was relaxing. You're able to get work done.
I know that's one reason why we like doing that instead of driving. But I hadn't really thought about the angle that people might be wanting to take the train more because it was going to cost just as much to drive.
I think so, and it's funny because people seem to, at least my experience, people talk a lot more on the trains than they do on an airplane. Like everybody's miserable on an airplane, but people on the train seemed, I don't know, in a little better mood.
Yeah. I mean, and maybe that's been over time because I remember people talking to me a lot when I was traveling by air for a while. But it was also, sometimes that was okay. And then sometimes it was really annoying. So I think there's always that aspect because maybe you didn't want to talk to people right then.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's because, and this was shocking, there's no security on the train. I mean, zero. You just walk in there, no metal detector, no baggage check, no nothing. You just walk on, throw your luggage on the train. So I think that's maybe why everybody's not so frustrated and haven't gone through TSA.
Well, that's definitely can improve your mood for sure. I know then there's always like these things called like quiet cars because they get annoyed about people talking and stuff. Did you see any of that or?
Yeah, no, you know what I ended up doing is they had a thing that allowed you to upgrade to business class or bid on an upgrade. And I think each way I only paid 15 extra bucks. It was in business class. Business class wasn't that fancy, but it was a little bit roomier and generally it was a little quieter. Yeah.
That sounds interesting. I know when I moved to Albany after graduating from college, I was really surprised then how much the Amtrak trains were. They were really prohibitive. It was so much cheaper to take a plane. And I just could not get over that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly. I don't know why they're relatively cheap right now.
I don't know why they were ever so high. Like,
that part makes sense to me because
really?
It's probably not subsidized at all.
But that would be twice the price of an airplane trip?
Yeah, especially back then. You're thinking like the early 2000s. This is before when oil was super cheap. So it kind of makes sense. So it would be.
I guess. I just didn't understand why I could take an airplane, even to New York City, and it was going to be half the price that the train was.
Yeah. So I don't know what's going on. I know Amtrak has expanded its services in the last 5 years. And I'm sure they're super happy Joe Biden's president and has funneled some additional infrastructure money.
Probably, he just advertises for it since he's, been doing the train.
Did that? Yeah, does the Amtrak commute. Maybe the same Northeast line that, we'll end up taking into New York in April.
Looking forward to seeing what that's like going up to New York.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So while you were gone, I was able to interview Dr. Shahin Berenji, who was a colleague of mine at UCLA. And we had a good conversation about NATO expansion. Did we fail as the West to fully understand why Russia might think that it was a security threat to them? But I also felt that came up in that conversation, which you'll hear, so I don't want to say too much about it, but that really it seemed to me that Russia was more threatened by the increasing democratization of these countries and the loss of influence, right? Because realists so much define power as military. And you can see this in some sense in our discussion about how to help Ukraine. It's all about military equipment. But power is about the ability to influence the decision of others. And military is one component of it, but it's not necessarily the biggest component. And it's almost kind of unfortunate, Nye's labeling of soft power, because if it's just non-military power, how soft is it? It's just power. You just want power, right? Whether it's through economics or military.
There's nothing soft about the economic power that's being displayed now.
Exactly. So I think, it's not so much just about prestige, although that was feeding into Putin's ego, but I think the real fear of lacking influence. And I think from every angle we've said before, it was a bad gamble. China also wanted to increase its influence by aligning with Russia itself, thinking that Russia was going to shift some of this his way, get some sort of victory out of this. But yes, it's just been a disaster on every scale.
Yeah, I think it'll always be a mystery on why he didn't stick with the incremental kind of death by 1,000 cuts. I think that from a Russian perspective is far more effective in terms of, picking apart the Western alliance and weakening NATO and buying time, honestly, to the 2024 U.S. elections.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Joining us today is Dr. Shahin Berenji, who received his PhD in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles. He is currently the Colin Powell Postdoctorate Teaching Fellow in the Department of Political Science and the John G. Tower Center for Public Policy and International Affairs at Southern Methodist University. His work addresses the question as to why and when decision makers make the choice to cooperate in rivalries. Shahin was also a colleague of mine at UCLA and a friend. Welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be with you, Anita.
While your research is primarily focused on events during the Cold War, it certainly sheds light on the West's relationship with Russia today as it relates to the Russia-Ukraine war. What do you think of the explanation that the West should take responsibility for the current conflict because it ignored Russia's protest against NATO expansion?
I think that that is definitely one interpretation out there, that the West is partly or largely to blame for the current conflict. I mean, if you look at what prominent realists have written, George Kennan, kind of the architect of the United States' containment policy during the Cold War, he wrote an article, I believe, in the New York Times or so in the late 1990s, basically criticizing NATO's expansion into Eastern European countries that had formerly been part of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet-led collective security organization, right? And so NATO expanded in the first wave in the late 90s and 1999 to include Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary. And people like Kennan actually believed that would provoke Russia, that would provoke them to do something. But yet we kind of ignored that warning. And people like John Mersheimer, of course, another prominent realist, he's written quite extensively about this, about how despite Russian protests and Russia's clear opposition to NATO expansion, NATO enlargement, the United States and its allies continued to expand it. And in the second wave, countries like Romania, Bulgaria, I believe Slovakia, I think you had some of the Baltic states then enter, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, began to enter into the NATO alliance. And by 2015, by 2020, NATO had clearly included almost 30 countries. Most of the Warsaw Pact states, the countries in Eastern Europe that had been aligned with the Soviet Union, became part of NATO. Countries that had now been formerly part of the Soviet Union, meaning part of the Soviet Union itself. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia were now part of NATO. Ukraine expressed interest in 2008 in joining NATO, as did Georgia. And so NATO expansion was proceeding at breakneck speed. And every time you had more and more countries, professing an interest or wanting to join, Russia expressed opposition. And yet we kind of disregarded that. We ignored it. And realists argued that we did that to our own detriment. Because if you're a realist, Russia's fears over NATO expansion make sense, because NATO was created during the Cold War largely to organize the United States and the Western European allies against Russia. So it makes sense why Russia would be fearful of NATO enlargement.
One thing I want to ask, though, about that is, you say Ukraine started to push for membership in 2008. That is also when Russia invaded Georgia. So it seems that a lot of the push to join NATO was because of these countries having security concerns about Russia. And because they're smaller states, it seems almost more that their concerns are even more legitimate than maybe Russia, where it's really hard for me to see how he really saw NATO as a real threat to Russia, that he really thought that NATO would invade them or any of these countries would invade Russia.
Right. I mean, the other kind of flip side to that is Putin launched an attack against Georgia because Georgia had expressed interest in joining NATO. So in other words, one argument why Georgia is so interested and why Ukraine is so interested is because of the threat posed by Russia. And that the same could hold true for the Baltic states, for countries like Poland and Eastern Europe. And I think there is a genuine failure to understand on Russia's side, to understand the perspective of Eastern European countries that had been dominated or influenced by the Soviet Union, and then before that by Tsarist Russia. There is a genuine fear that Russia may become aggressive again and may try to subdue them or take them over or invade. That fear prompts them to want to join NATO. And the more that they want to join NATO, though, the more that may provoke Russia to attack. So it's kind of this vicious action-reaction cycle, which is they both have legitimate fears, but yet the actions that they are taking to deal with these fears, these threats that they believe may actually be bringing them closer and closer toward an actual conflict, a war. And I think kind of things have reached a head with Ukraine just recently.
Yeah, so I want to go more into that. And I'm still really having the hardest time understanding to the extent that Russia really felt there was a threat. And, sort of even, NATO's expansion also was explained as democracy promotion. And, it specifically stated that any country becoming a democracy had the right to apply for NATO membership.
So I think that we talked about kind of the realist explanation, how some blame is laid at the United States and West's doorstep. But I think kind of a second explanation, second interpretation of the Russia-Ukraine war would be this argument that, Russia is behaving aggressively. They shouldn't have this threat perception of the West, of NATO, the NATO alliance, the kind of pillars of the liberal world order that people often talk about, spreading democracies, linking economies or promoting economic interdependence, enlarging and strengthening regional and international institutions like the European Union, like NATO. These types of things, according to those who subscribe to liberalism, bring about stability and cooperation and peace. States should not fear these types of actions, and therefore Russia should not fear if Ukraine democratizes, or if the Ukraine joins the EU, or if Ukraine joins NATO, because these in the end are part of this liberal world order that has helped maintain the peace in Western Europe, prevented great power rivalries between Germany, for instance, and France, and Germany and England, and therefore Russia shouldn't fear this type of expansion of the liberal world order. There's a great finding that democracies don't fight other democracies, the democratic peace theory. Therefore, why would Russia fear Ukraine kind of aligning itself with the West and with the liberal world order in this way? And I think from Russia's perspective, the liberal world order is a rules-based order, and it's a system that favors the United States. Because if the United States is expanding democracies, like helping to transform Ukraine into a vibrant, successful democracy, it is really going to be remaking Ukraine in its own image. And Ukraine will therefore have more in common with the US than with its next door neighbor, Russia. That's going to bring the United States a better and a closer ally to Russia's borders. And that may pose a threat from Russia's perspective. And once Ukraine democratizes, who's to say that the people in Russia might not look at what happens to Ukraine, or people in Belarus might look at what's happening in Ukraine and might be inspired themselves to rebel or to seek a change in their own governments. So I think that's a fear of Russia. I think also the expansion of NATO and the enlargement of the European Union, these are two organizations that from Russia's perspective are threatening, because it's not that they're being organized without Russia. It's that they're being enlarged and strengthened purposefully kind of against Russia. And I think from Russia's perspective, that is threatening. And so if you subscribe to liberalism, you believe this might, these kind of pillars of the liberal world order help bring about stability. You would just say, you know what, Russia's wrong. Their threat perception is based off a flawed interpretation. And that's the second interpretation, that it's Russia who's behaving aggressively. This liberal world order that the United States has built a foundation upon is a peaceful order. And therefore, countries should have nothing to fear. And therefore, Russia is purposefully aggressive and is deliberately aggressive. And we should take actions to deal with that.
I'm going to push back a little bit on that. I don't know that I feel like NATO, even with its emphasis on allowing democratic countries to join, is really an example of those institutions. But I do think, the European Union obviously is an example. And it seems to me, rather than security concerns, Russia felt more the power, its loss of power and influence concerns, right? So rather than there being an actual military threat from NATO, which even in their own documents say that they don't fear, but one of their justifications for 2014 was like a trade deal between Ukraine and the EU. So I feel like what you're saying is more like it loses its ability to influence other nations if they all become more Western. Anyway, I find that aspect I hadn't fully thought of, but as you were saying that, I feel like that's maybe a more convincing explanation.
Like an explanation rooted in like prestige and reputation, Russia trying to reestablish its image in the world as a very strong, great power that other states have to contend with. I think that is a very compelling explanation at that. I completely agree with you in that respect. I think Russia's actions in Ukraine right now, if anything, have motivated NATO to mobilize in a way that we haven't seen since the end of the Cold War. NATO, I think you're right. The threat perception that Russia had of NATO was like, there's this organization that's pushing closer and closer to my border. But that organization wasn't really that big of a threat because NATO wasn't expanding its military, putting military forces on a large scale on Russia's borders up until recently, with Russia's invasion of annexation of Crimea, and then now recently the invasion of Ukraine. NATO really hasn't sought to militarize many of these Eastern European countries. And so I think Russia's actions and its threat perception, NATO, might be over-exaggerated and overblown in that respect.
So I think prestige is part of it. I think, though, also just general influence is part of it too. Like, not just the prestige, but being able to have some influence over Ukrainian decisions. So I also want to talk about an important element of your work when you're talking about why decision makers make these decisions to cooperate. You talk a lot about being able to empathize, that these leaders have to empathize the concerns of the other side. So I wonder if you could talk about that.
Well, in my work on the end of the Cold War, I really study the different summits between Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev and U.S. President Ronald Reagan, and the dramatic progress they were able to make on various issues in arms control, including in medium and intermediate range nuclear armed ballistic missiles, which led to the INF Treaty, the signing of that in 1987, a historic treaty that basically banned or got eliminated ground-launched medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles. But what I found in that why they were able to make progress was because Gorbachev especially was able to empathize. And by empathy, I'm not talking about sympathy. There are multiple definitions of empathy. One definition of empathy is essentially being able to take the perspective of your adversary, of your rival. It's being able to put yourself in the shoes of the other side, reflect on the thoughts and feelings of the other party without necessarily having to share it or share them on an emotional level. And that's exactly how Gorbachev was able to understand, okay, the United States clearly views the Soviet Union as a threat. And they view the Soviet Union as a threat because of these types of ballistic missiles, because it has such a large conventional military force, right? These are the reasons why NATO fears us. This is the reason why the United States fears us. Well, how about we start to tackle systematically those main issues and those problems that are at the heart of the dispute that makes the United States insecure? And Reagan, to his credit, gains a better sense as to Gorbachev's perspective, especially at the Reykjavik summit. They both learn that they really have this aversion to nuclear weapons, that they both really want to reduce and hopefully sometime down the line eliminate nuclear weapons because of how deadly and destructive these things are and how dangerous they are. And so they are able to reflect and take the perspective of each other. And in that way, this is how the Cold War gradually kind of winds down, because these leaders had the kind of foresight to kind of understand and put themselves in the shoes of the other party. It was very important on the side of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was able to do that. Now, I think if you reflect on what's going on in the present, in the lead up to the Ukraine conflict, there wasn't a whole lot of empathizing by any of the parties. I mean, if you look at the United States and the Western European countries, they weren't willing to, even though Ukraine was invited and Georgia were invited both to join NATO back in 2008, no timeline was given, no pathway was given for them to do so. It was just kind of this general goal that we would like to welcome them in at some point. And even though no timeline or deadline had been set for that, the United States and other countries in the NATO alliance, especially France and Germany, I mean, the US was probably more supportive of welcoming Ukraine into NATO, but France and Germany were a little hesitant because of what Russia might do. And the United States was unable to reflect on, and its allies, on how much Russia feared NATO expansion, especially as it related to Ukraine and Georgia. And I think the fact that the United States didn't make any sort of, let's just talk about the Ukrainian perspective. We kind of get into the kind of policy implication. The Ukrainians didn't make any concessions on this kind of issue of NATO, the EU, or Russia's other concern regarding the status of Russian minorities in Ukraine. The Zelensky government had been taking some steps to reduce or ban the usage of Russian in schools and state institutions. So there was some concerns that the Russians had about Ukraine entering NATO and entering the EU and Ukraine's policy towards Russian speakers. And Ukraine didn't really address these types of issues in the lead up to the war. Russia, of course, there's a total failure of empathy because Russia's, as I said earlier, they're just not, at least especially Putin's, not thinking about the perspective of Eastern European countries and, well, why do they feel pressured? Why do they want to join NATO so badly? It's because many of them fear a possible invasion and attack by Russia. So I think if you survey the situation, you look at it, I think there is definitely a lack of empathy on all sides. And I think moving forward, if we're thinking about how we can resolve the Ukraine conflict, I think these different parties will have to take into account the interests of the other side to some degree. And that in that way, you can kind of move forward and craft an agreement, hopefully one that's long lasting and durable.
But we have talked for quite a while. And so I just want to thank you so much. I mean, this is a great discussion and I hope we can have more of them. And, so thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Anita, for having me on the podcast. It was a pleasure to talk to you about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And I really hope that this war gets resolved very quickly and very soon.
We all do. And we will have your website in the show notes. And we really encourage everybody to go there and you can find out more about Shahin's research, which I think is really interesting. So thank you.
All right. Thank you.
So we wanted to go on and talk more about these sanctions and energy markets. And so we're going to start with energy markets. And what are some points you wanted to touch on there?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously everybody's been heavily impacted around the world by the volatility in the energy markets. And I think what I wanted to touch on was just the actions that have been taken in terms of reaching out to other adversarial regimes around increasing oil production. So just taking a step back as a reminder to our listeners, so the energy exports coming from Russia. So Russia is currently the third largest producer of oil in the world at about 11 million barrels a day, but they're actually the biggest exporter. So they export 7 million barrels, of which about 5 million goes to countries that are part of the sanction regime. So part of either Western Europe, the Anglo-American countries, or Japan, South Korea. So in order to make up for that gap, because what you're having with that 5 million. So obviously the U.S. announced its banning of imports of Russian oil, which amounts to about 200,000 barrels of crude, but about 600,000 barrels a day of other products, so gasoline, diesel, all the sort of things that could be made out of crude oil. But the remainder is technically free from any sort of sanction regime. But what you're finding is that there's a lot of self-sanctioning going on. Daniel Yergin wrote a great piece in The Economist really talking about that. And it's just, one, public companies are afraid of the reputational risk. So blowback from the public, from their brand. So they don't want to accept these shipments. Another problem is the insuring these shipments, if it's especially seaborne shipments, and that's a critical component. I think most of the oil comes via pipeline, but some of it comes via ship. They can't get insurance. So in reality, a good part of that 7 million is sitting out in ocean vessels with no buyers currently. So how do you make up that gap on the global market? So what has the White House done? Well, they tried calling Saudi Arabia and UAE, our good Arab buddies. They did not take Biden's call.
I know, that was amazing.
Fully stonewalling, yeah.
I was surprised they didn't even take the call. I don't know why I say amazing. I mean, that was surprising.
Yeah, especially the UAE too. But when you're really talking about this, you're talking about the Saudis. The Saudis are the central bank essentially of the oil industry. They're thought to have 1 to 2 million in spare capacity. So they on their own, in theory, could bring that sort of volume onto the market within, a couple months at most. Which
we've spoken about why it's theoretical, but also more on their unwillingness, right? Because, in some ways, people argue that could be a gain for them to have less market competition.
That's true. I think the other reason, and all of these are like intertied, as we'll see, but they're mad at the White House because of the lack of support for the war in Yemen. So they basically had a blank check during the Trump administration. Anybody that knows, the atrocities that have been committed, often with U.S. sourced weaponry, just really horrific. The other thing that the Saudis are,
I'm sorry, we should include an article to that in the web show notes, because I don't think most people know what's happening in Yemen.
Yeah, it's one of the numerous proxy wars between Iran and the Arab world that's going on. But it's particularly brutal because of the tactics that the Saudis have used in waging of this war. Similar in terms of the care for human life that Putin has waged in the Ukraine.
Right. And so when we talk about like evil regimes, we ignore countries like Saudi Arabia. I mean, some of their actions have been labeled by some as genocide. I don't know enough about it, but I know that it's easily as cruel as what Putin is doing to civilians.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not good.
And they were doing it with our weapons too. So that was...
Yeah, and so a lot of that's been withdrawn in terms of the support, for instance, of kind of the Air Force and certain missile systems that we're not resupplying, we're not providing kind of the logistical support to wage that war anymore. So they're angry about that. They're also angry because of the Iran deal. So that kind of brings us to Iran. So the other area where the White House is trying to bring additional production capacity back to the market. So I was reading today, it's possible this week could be a big announcement. They seem like they're close onto the main terms. I know Republicans are very angry about all the provisions coming out. I think they briefed the U.S. House Intelligence Committee last week. What details have come out, they feel like is too generous, but would, upon verification of that they are reducing the refinement of nuclear products for weapon-grade plutonium, that you could return up to 1 million barrels a day to the market over time.
Right, over time. So what I remember, because I was teaching political economy for the first time, international political economy, first time when all this was going on prior to the Trump administration. And there were kind of two issues during that period of, you had one, they've gone decades without Western investment. And so oil companies, the ones that had tentatively kind of were looking to invest, I know France's Total was, you certainly didn't have any U.S. oil companies because they felt that the investment was fragile, right? They didn't know how long, if this was going to be a continuous path or not, or sanctions would return again to Iran. So they need a lot of...
It's definitely underinvested, but it's in a much better shape than like the Venezuelan oil sector is. So I feel fairly confident. Plus, I would imagine that the Chinese have their own kind of PetroChina and somewhat sophisticated oil industry. So, yeah, the capacity issues, the technology issues aren't as severe in Iran. But yeah, I mean, definitely there could be a lot more with foreign investors coming back in. So the Total and BP and...
But it's hard to get them. I imagine it's going to be very hard to get them to go back because you're making these investments you don't know.
Yeah, I think we all know, and we talked about this in probably 2 or 3 episodes ago around this. Yeah, there's no way that this agreement's going to last through a change in administration.
So why do you invest money in it?
Yeah, you're not going to. And those 2 companies also are on an energy transition. So competing for capital when it's that risky too in the oil sector, there's no way Iran would be able to attract that investment. It would strictly be China and Russia, assuming Russia's out of a regime. But that was the other thing that came up in this is Russia inserted itself at the last minute into negotiations saying, okay, we're on board with this, but you have to, any Russian companies involved can't be sanctioned in this additional investment in Iran. But they backed off of that. So that's basically what seems like a green light that this deal is going through.
Interesting. I mean, it's interesting because Russia has been such a key part of these negotiations. And that was something a lot of people were emphasizing when this was brought up again, that Russia was one of the key players and how this would go forward. I don't know the details. Is it similar to what the previous deal was, or are we giving more concessions to Iran?
Yeah, I can only imagine from some of, and again, I don't know the details. I'm not sure the full details are out yet. But given the speed in which this kind of came together and the fact that we were talking a month ago that it seemed like it was dead, makes me think that the U.S. gave a lot more in order to get the deal, in order to bring more stability to energy markets. So it's going to be interesting to see if there is some sort of announcement in the next week or 2 about a reinstatement of the deal in some form, and then kind of what the details are.
Again, I was in favor of the previous deal. I mean, I think Iran had agreed to the highest level of outside inspections that any country would have ever done, impeding on its sovereignty. But I feel critical of this if we're being motivated by losing Russian oil, because it's just then like, well, these are not good regimes, these are not good examples. Even like as bad as Venezuela is, they don't really threaten other nations. I mean, they don't have the capacity to threaten other nations. Whereas, Iran still does. And they're all fighting, these, as you said, proxy wars. And they're doing so in a way that through terrorizing populations by targeting these civilians in horrible ways and atrocious human rights violations. And to say that we're accomplishing something good by, not buying Russian oil, but then buying oil from these places, I don't think there's a moral good here.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. But that's the nature of oil and where it is and what it does to regimes. I mean, what petrostates, the corruption that it causes and shapes, how these countries behave. So I think wrapping up this section, I mean, so the last one was Venezuela, which, you've studied a lot. So the State Department began negotiations about 2 weeks ago to begin the possible loosening of sanctions on oil, which I think have been in place since at least 2019. And you could bring back up to 600,000 barrels a day. And what we saw after that meeting was Venezuela did release 2 jailed U.S. citizens. One of them was a Citgo oil executive. And it was seen as a goodwill gesture Not a quid pro quo, because that was accused, essentially that, oh, you've made some sort of deal or you're going to get rid of the sanction. They released the sanction. But this is
Did
just
you not see me roll my eyes right there? Because,
okay.
yes, like seriously, this is, well, one, it's horrible that they had these prisoners, but this is the sort of thing you do in a negotiation to show, it's a signal of your, yes, well, it's a signal of we're
serious about negotiating. Yeah. So domestically, I don't know. It's already getting a lot of pushback. Obviously, a lot of the Venezuelan constituents in Florida. It's also opposed by Juan Guaido, who is the political opponent that failed kind of in the very short coup attempt during the Trump administration. Yeah. Sure, yeah.
I mean, that's who. I mean, no, he launched a truly brave democratic effort. And, the West supported him using these sanctions. I think I can look up when I was writing in my blog at the time, using these sanctions to kind of force that regime change I always thought was not the way to go about it, but it was good. I mean, the West all said, oh, we recognize him and we don't recognize the other government, which is also, though, kind of problematic because as much as you want the challenger to win, the other government is still in control. And so to not acknowledge it doesn't make a lot of sense either. There's a lot of symbolism. But he lost. I mean, the problem is he lost, putting some sanctions, devastating sanctions on a country does not necessarily help a challenger win the presidency, right? And he lost, and Maduro's in charge. And whether we decide we want to deal with that or not is... But of course he opposes it. I mean, and people who support it. But I don't know. Out of everything, Venezuela is in some ways the least.
Yeah, it's definitely the least impactful in terms of the barrels you're likely to get, given the state of their industry and
that. And then also, and they're not fighting a lot of proxy wars. They don't have the capacity to do it.
Yeah, no, they don't. I mean, it's probably just providing some of the remnants for FARC within Colombia, that they would provide some support, material support. But honestly, they're in such bad state. I can't imagine it's a lot.
Yeah. I mean, if any of it ended up going to the people itself, which is where the money was taken from, that would be good because they have had a huge COVID crisis because they don't have a medical system functioning. And I know massive migration to Colombia because of that, over 1 million, I think.
Yeah. So... And then, on the U.S. side, I think we already covered kind of the domestic drivers for U.S. production. But, I mean, the rig count is definitely going up. It is, a follower of the free market and to price responses. So you've seen a significant increase in rig count. I know that the EIA is calling for record production this year from the U.S. So from current rates, I think they're expecting around, 1 million additional barrels coming to the market. All of this is kind of baked in. One news that did come out this week that the markets liked and oil price fell significantly from its peak was the fact that you have another COVID variant that is breaking out and hitting Asia particularly hard.
Starting to hit Europe really hard.
Yeah, Europe, it will hit us, I have no doubt, in the next month or so. But it's affected the supply chain issues. You've seen massive shutdowns, I think, in Shenzhen. Hong Kong, obviously, heavily impacted. So that's going to lower the oil demand. So it's going to help on the demand side. So that's the other thing going on. But it's been very volatile. I wouldn't expect any relief at the pump over the next 6 months or so.
Although people wonder, and maybe you can comment on that, why barrels of oil can plunge so dramatically, but you don't see the dramatic decrease in what you pay at the pump.
Yeah, it takes a while to work through. I mean, it's different parts of the business because it's the downstream.
Why doesn't it take long to have the prices go up?
Why does it take long for the prices?
Right? Because you're saying the prices go up immediately.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I don't know the downstream part of the business that well or kind of the price drivers. I will say that in general, the downstream part is much lower margins. I'm not saying that they purposely, when they have an opportunity to raise those margins, that they're slower. I mean, obviously it's a almost perfect competitive environment. There's no collusion, there's no monopolies, it's a very, very competitive market with a global commodity. I don't know, but I will look that up for next time on why, because I know lots of people complain about that.
Yeah, but it's something that is kind of curious. I mean, I get that they may have bought like the oil, the gas in advance, so they're still trying. But at the same time, if that was true, it seems like they'd be slower to increase prices.
Yeah. And I know, I mean, like in California, there was always connection to go into different blends, to the winter versus the summer blend. And when that switch would occur, that would affect prices because that's to do with the smog requirements and pollutants and things along those lines. But I will research it and let the audience know.
So one of the things that I think really gets lost in this sanctions on Russia, I mean, I see so many people, policy and academics who, not any of the academics who work on sanctions, but outside of that, like be really enthusiastic about this and punishing Russia and wanting to see the full brunt of these sanctions last for a very long time. As I've said, well, one, it doesn't help just destroy the economy because Putin's going to be affected. It's going to be millions of Russians, tens of millions of Russians who are going to lose everything, right? And then they're just going to become very anti-West. And then even create a lot of instability in Russia, politically and economically. And really, who wants a lot of instability in a country? So I feel like there are definitely important sanctions that we can keep on Russia after this conflict when ideally a deal has been made, and Russia, I don't think we should keep them as they are. But, certain ones, I was talking to this woman who's a professor, and I cannot remember at what university, but she also worked in the state and import-exports. And we were talking the tech exports, dual-use technology sanctions were some of the most important levers that don't get talked about in preventing, any sort of military innovation, being able to sustain the military. So you can have things like that don't devastate an entire economy. Because there are also downsides for other countries. And so not all of this is due to sanctions. I mean, some of it is just due to the war, but it's made worse by the sanctions. And so, so there's food security, food stability. One thing that we forget so often in the way we talk about national security, it's about invasions from other countries or even terrorism. But food security has long been thought to be one of the most important aspects of national security. And of course, if people are starving, all kinds of massive uprisings happen. But, it also can be a tool in war that's been quite devastating. I mean, like sanctions, it's Germany, World War I, at least they ran out of food. Basically, not only are consumers in America and Europe going to see much higher prices for grains, grains are in a lot of things, and then the result of fertilizer problems. But what people are really concerned about is how this is going to affect lower income countries who can't afford to spend a greater amount of their budget on food. So like as in Latin America, Africa, many areas. And you're destroying whole economies there. And that's going to lead to a lot of political unrest. And I know that our attention span doesn't always hold to that and the sort of military aggressions against each other in Africa. But there'll be humanitarian crises all over the world. And that is something we should care about. If we want to support this war in Ukraine, we cannot just think of it in terms of how much weapons we are giving to Ukraine. We have to address all of these issues. So if we really support this war in Ukraine, that means putting additional money into humanitarian assistance for all these places and to help keep them stabilized.
Yeah, I think it's really seeing seeing these secondary effects, anticipating them, and actually getting out ahead of them. Unlike the Syria crisis, where we could have done upfront, and I know you always advocated for putting that humanitarian aid, the refugee camps in neighboring Jordan and Lebanon, and supporting the population more locally, instead of it turning into a crisis, which then turned into a political crisis within Europe, which led to, among other things, kind of the rise of the far right, of potentially Brexit, just all these sort of knock-on effects that destabilized Europe to a certain extent. You could definitely see, because when you're going in sub-Saharan Africa and you're almost doubling the effective amount of income that you need for food, that's going to destabilize a lot of those countries in a short time period.
A very short time period. So, when you're saying about that Syria, because I did think that our political choices in Syria were really, really difficult. And a lot of my friends who were very concerned about this were really focused on U.S. military involvement. But for me, again, I guess I see when we don't have good choices there, or we can't fight on the ground, the humanitarian part is just as important security-wise. It's not just about bleeding hearts or compassion, which it should be about, but it's about security. If you are truly interested in national security, global security. So when I was promoting okay, it doesn't make sense to have these crises in Jordan and Turkey, Lebanon. Some of these countries have very little capacity, and they were taking in millions and trying to incorporate them into schools, and they were begging the West for money to help them do that. And I was like, why should it fall on Jordan, right? Why should Jordan have to pay all these costs themselves? And, I don't know the intricacies of the Jordan politics, but they were considered an ally, a stable ally, maybe not democratic, but not as authoritarian, I don't know, somewhere in between. And we just abandoned them because we don't prioritize those sorts of things. And then, as you said, it led to all of those things. And for me, it's I was concerned about the initial security. You can't even anticipate exactly how the secondary effects are going to happen, right? But we can see easily, we can think through some of them, and we're not thinking through them. It's very irritating because we can see this happening. I have very, very little faith that the U.S. Congress will actually make any real money behind this to prop up these efforts before it happens, right? And working through institutions that have been set up to deal with food crises.
Yeah, no, I don't know, but I'm sure there's somebody in the State Department. There is a plan, but again, funding through Congress.
There might be a plan in the State Department.
Because this is such a secondary sort of thing. Everybody's so focused on, one, that military aid, to what you're saying, to the Ukraine, and then humanitarian aid to Ukraine, supporting the European countries. But then you have all these knock-on economic secondary effects that need to be accounted for.
Strengthening the institutions that we've been weakening through the lack of funding, which is the UN, humanitarian, and food relief, that have done amazing things in countries that have had these sort of famines, but on a smaller scale. And so we need to use those institutions. I don't think we're giving a lot of money in the United States to the humanitarian effort to European countries. I think we're pretty much allowing, Europe to take care of that, or telling Europe that they need to take care of that.
No, and I think it's natural for the EU to take the lead in those matters, yeah.
But we could do this in advance. We could prepare for this. It's not something that's going to happen a long time in the future. We could have prepared better for the migrants. So one thing that has really struck, and I saw another thread on Twitter, someone in these agencies, even though we knew we were going to have this massive migration from Ukraine once the war started, at the time, there's no overall organization coordinating anything. And that meant there's no security to prevent human trafficking at all. And that's really actually contrast to other migration crises where you did have UN institutions and stuff that did provide security to help at least reduce that idea. there was this controversy recently this week that a couple of Harvard students put up an app, and I guess you can just put your name in it in an address if you want somebody to come. I don't know. I didn't look at the app itself, but the thing is, the critique against it and the strong backlash was that if they decide to sign up or go there, like it could be someone trafficking them. Like there's no security checks of people who list on there. And so, and Stephen was just talking about how like the board.
Who's Stephen? Sorry.
Thank you. My colleague at FBI, Stephen Shaggy, who we spoke a lot about on our last episode, his work there. But he said, it's just open doors. There's no like security for them. Somebody can just walk off with a whole bunch of them.
Yeah, that was really eye-opening.
And so there's going to be a human trafficking crisis out of this too, and that we're not doing anything about.
Yeah. So I think this is probably a good transition to the last topic that we wanted to cover. But obviously the impact on the developing world is going to be pretty severe. So I think what you've seen is kind of the effect of how this is perceived and the level of support for the Ukraine. Because certainly the way that, we get it sitting here in the US or from the Western media is that the entire world is very unified behind Ukraine. Putin is absolutely isolated and reviled around the world. China is the only supporter of Putin, and everyone else has more or less isolated him. And the reality is pretty different. So the West is certainly unified. So the rich democratic nations that make up Western Europe and the kind of the Anglo world, plus Japan and South Korea, have imposed very strong sanctions and has been very effective. And that represents a very large portion of the global economy.
But there's a real danger in saying, every time we say, oh, the world is against Putin, because the West is not the world. I mean, and we have made ourselves the center. We've had that definition, and then there's been pushback, and we were supposed to try to push back more on that, but we've gone back to this framing again. And also, I want to squeeze in there, what made me think about this topic in the beginning when we were thinking of it is that, okay, I'm not saying China does evil things. Let me just say that right ahead. But we want to have this war about good and evil, and we want to be able to put China completely in the Russian box and say, okay, well, China is this evil villain like Putin, right? And we're using this because they're not condemning Russia, right? And there's been a lot, when I was talking in a forum group at One Policy Institute, and I was talking about, everyone is this media report that, China's going to support, it's going to send weapons to Russia, and how, it's very little sourced, and they've never shown any indication. I mean, obviously, I guess the U.S. keeps telling them not to do it, but there's no sign that they were ever really considering it. And I just said, I think we sensationalize this. And the pushback was like, well, I mean, the media, what they're saying, they refuse to condemn. Until recently, they refused to call it a war. And it just made me think, well, is China the only country doing that? Is China even the only authoritarian country doing that? Because I knew at the same time that India had also not condemned Russia. And I don't believe they had called it a war for a long time either. So it's important that there are democracies, right? This is important too. We try to frame this as democracies against authoritarian, but India is one of the biggest democracies in the world, and something that the West keeps saying is going to be this ally, against China. And it is not condemning Russia.
Yeah, it goes back. So the Soviet Union, both for India and South Africa, had very strong ties to these countries. And in the case of India, supported them for some of their foreign policy, military interventions in the 70s. So the Soviet Union was the only one that supported them, provided military equipment. And so there's this especially in the case of South Africa, maybe to a lesser extent, the Indians. But yeah, there's this sort of romantic looking back of that relationship and the solidarity with the Soviet Union that they now tie to Russia. Now, India, I found, is particularly complicated because, as you alluded to, it is part of the Quad. So the new quasi-security agreement between the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia to honestly, to counter and contain China. Obviously, that's in India's interest. China is a significant threat. They have a series of border disputes. But at the same time, so going back to Russia, they built their entire military around Russian equipment. So 85% of their weapon systems are Russian-made, including their submarines and 100% of their tanks. And this is really because they couldn't afford Western equipment at the time. It was a much lower price point. And they can't not, afford to be without Russian equipment and replacement and spare parts and all that because they have these active border disputes, both with Pakistan and with China. So they're really stuck in a bind. And the way they've kind of tried to thread it.
I think that gives them too much lack of agency.
Well, I think they want to have it. I mean, they also have a policy which goes back to the Soviet Union days of
not condemning.
Well, no, of being, it's sort of the non-committed part of the world. So the ones that don't want to favor one or the other superpower bloc over the other. So India's always kind of had that. Honestly, during the Cold War, they leaned more towards the Soviet Union. But now but they still have that philosophy in terms of foreign policy of trying to balance. But it came as shocking, I think, to Western audiences of, hey, this is the big democracy, they're part of the Quad, why aren't they fully on board? And it's like, well, you can't dismiss this history and the actual material reality of, where their military's at and what their national security needs are.
Right. The consideration of people acting in their strategic interest is not also taken into account because, yes, Germany depends a lot on Russia, but it can afford to find other sources. And India is, acting in its own strategic. So it's not like this ideology of democracy versus authoritarian governments. And, it's just kind of funny, the graph of where the alliance between India and Russia are and then China, and then India, across, between. Anyway, that's what real politics looks like. Mm-hmm. But India also has a long stance about not liking sanctions against other countries.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, wasn't aware of that.
Yeah. And then when you wrote, I knew about South Africa, I knew about India. I guess I had not realized Israel was also.
Yes, Israel's another interesting one. And the dynamic there is a little newer, which goes back to Syria largely. And it's the fact that Russia and Putin's kind of expansionists in terms of gaining more global power, they obviously intervened in a pretty significant way in Syria to the point of propping up Assad. And they still currently have a significant, they're more or less the deal maker there and kind of a go-between. And Israel actually coordinates very closely with Russian troops in Syria in order to conduct strikes on Hezbollah, so the proxy terrorist organization of Iran. So they want to maintain a good relationship with Russia in order to be able to still strike out with impunity and not get targeted by the anti-aircraft weaponry within Syria that the Russians have put in place. Because the Russians want to keep Assad in power so that they can have access to the Mediterranean port in Tartus. So it's really just an absolute mess there. But it's created this strange dynamic. You do also have a cultural connection. Obviously, a lot of Jews from Russia came to Israel. So you do have not in a good condition.
Right. They came because they were getting kicked out of Russia and there's a lot of violence.
Yeah, but nevertheless, that creates a lot of business connections between the two countries. And there's a lot of investment. So Israel's been really reluctant. They, along with I swear 3 different countries want to be like the peace broker on the Ukraine-Russia between. Like China's like, yeah, we'll do it. South Africa's like, oh, well, Putin told us that we could do it. And then Israel's like, oh, yeah, we're natural. Come to Jerusalem. They've been a little reluctant to do it because I think Zelensky actually asked, is like, hey, can we have one in Jerusalem?
So remember they went to Ukraine or Russia in the very beginning.
Yeah.
To try to be that peace broker.
Yeah.
And they were kind of rejected. But I've also read that a lot of these elites have also escaped to Israel.
Right. Yeah. So that one's pretty messy. And I don't think it's sustainable. Domestically, I know they're getting pushback for the stance. So this may be one that shifts to an out-and-out condemnation of it over time. That's probably the one most likely to shift out of the ones that we've discussed.
But still, you'll have all these oligarchs there that...
Right. I mean, they got to park their yachts somewhere. Yeah. I mean, so many $100 million yachts have been seized. It's tragic for them. I
realized I shouldn't have been surprised because I remember seeing the story in the beginning of the conflict. And I was like, what? Israel didn't, condemn this? And then people were talking about how many of the oligarchs had fled to Israel. So I get all those complicated strategic. I just, the way the U.S. props up Israel as well, it just seems like that should also be more into their consideration. But a lot of these countries feel like, well, the U.S. is going to support them no matter what, right? India is like, they need us for China. So whatever we do here, it's not like the U.S. is going to shut us out or stop embracing us.
It's still in our interest to have them as part of the
so
policy.
They're like,
still, we need Israel to help contain Iran's malign influence.
Mm-hmm. So they can make these interests. I mean, you get into that's what's complicated. We want, me, as I've said to you before, we want these simple narratives. And it sounds awesome to say this is a fight for liberal democracy and it's between democracies and autocracies. But the reality is that it's not.
Oh, yeah. No, it's all complicated. Every nation is going to look after its own national interest. It has its own unique histories and ties. I found South Africa was an interesting one because this didn't tie necessarily to economic ties or to military equipment because they're relatively, Russia's not that important, but it tied back to the historic period during apartheid. And during this period, the Soviet Union trained and supported the anti-apartheid activists during the Cold War and provided kind of direct economic aid during that period. So there's almost that's where the kind of the romanticism around the solidarity during, for South African history, obviously with Nelson Mandela and the whole anti-apartheid just morally such an important movement in the Soviet Union, to its credit and to its strategic advantage, supported that before the Western countries, kind of came up with the boycott and ended up ending that regime. But the Soviet Union was there first. So they kind of have this personal, especially at the elite level, personal affection for Russia because of those historic ties.
Right. And during that, the U.S. has taken the wrong side many times. And we've covered it with this romanticism in the Cold War of us versus evil. But we committed a lot of evil in doing that.
Yeah, I think.
Seriously.
Yeah, when it's framed as we'll support anybody that's against a left wing.
Right. They didn't even have to be very left wing, and they put Pinochet. I cannot remember his name, but before Pinochet, but they helped get him out of office. Pinochet killed hundreds of thousands. They're still finding these mass graveyards of what Pinochet did. He was evil. And he was trained in the United States. And we made a lot of decisions that perpetuated that. Not to say that past evil, the past wrong decisions has to keep you from making good ones, or that you can't still say you stand for democracy despite some. But you have to, you have to do more to acknowledge about the times where you were not supporting democracy.
Yeah, and I think, this decisions have consequences. A lot of those decisions were led around the central mission of destroying the Soviet Union and destroying global communism. And we sacrificed a lot of moral authority for that. And, that's the reason that Russia is not isolated and alone and has support in the developing world, is because of those decisions and the consequences during the Cold War. I mean, I think that's the common tie that we see in all of these.
Millions of people died because of our decisions.
Yeah. I mean, the decision was made that global communism was a greater threat to humanity and that heavy prices
but they weren't our prices,
heavily
right?
be debate. They were not ours. They're like somebody else's bodies are going to be.
Exactly. Of people that we didn't care about because they were not Americans. They were, largely, yeah. So I mean.
Yeah, so it's complicated. But, this is part of the blowback effect or the consequences of history.
Yeah. So I think it's really interesting that you're showing how that creates this very, kind of different narrative. Very different than the one you see on TV. And one I thought for a long time was very important. Mexico was surprising, because so I knew when I was studying Venezuela that both Cuba and Russia have very important role. I actually was surprised to find so much Cuban involvement in Venezuelans' politics, like in supporting Maduro, the military side. I know you're giving me that look.
Oh, that Cuba support?
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm not surprised by that. They've always been.
I guess that I don't think of the Cuban military like having these major capabilities, but.
Well, I mean, honestly, a lot of them don't. I mean, Colombia is probably the most capable military in the region. So yeah, on the left side, they don't have the equipment or money to fund a big military machine. So yeah, I'm not surprised Cuba's probably the best out of the bunch.
So anyway, so that surprised, so there's definitely those ties that didn't surprise me, but I'm more surprised by Mexico.
Yeah, Mexico stood out. I mean, I'm not surprised. I knew this was a left-wing guy who was definitely aggressive against the oil industry within Mexico. But yeah, President López Obrador, I think it's really dealing, even though obviously the economic ties to the United States are huge. I mean, easily the most important country and most important relationship. But yeah, has gone out in the line saying, hey, we're not going to do any economic sanctions on Russia. They don't have particularly strong ties with Mexico, but I think just ideologically and anti-American,
I think
that part is shared.
So we also have to talk about this, even though, some of these may be what we think of allies. I don't want to get into our domestic politics, but you can't have, a president like ours who says the kind of crap that he did to Mexico and these other countries and then be like, oh, why won't they support us?
Right. I mean, to be fair, Trump actually had a good working relationship with Obrador. That was the surprising thing. Even though this is a left-wing guy, for whatever reason, him and Trump got along. And, I think the border policy, where more of it was handled on the Mexican side. I
mean, I don't know. When I hear the Mexican diplomats have a kind of a different story.
Yeah. But honestly, it's always been a contentious relationship historically for a variety of different reasons. So there's always been that strain of anti-Americanism in there. I mean, God, they were allying with the French and then the Germans to try to retake California during...
Okay, that is too far historically. You're going a step way too far.
Hey, Putin's trying to rebuild the 19th century Russian Empire. So all this stuff's in vogue again.
It's not. I think there's a difference between India's, colonial memories and how it forged, Indian identity than Mexico allying with the French to take California. I don't think those have the same.
I think that was more the Germans. Gosh, I can't remember. Was that part of the... Yeah, I think that was part of the reasons we got pulled into World War I. Was around that conspiracy. I can't remember what the name was. AP US history was so long ago.
Yeah. So I mean, in all these things, our past foreign policy has consequences, in different ways. And I think in these sort of ways.
Yeah. So I think it's just keeping this in mind. And I think it's important when we look ahead for this competition with China. This gives you a real good indication of where the U.S. and its European allies kind of stand in terms of their ability to have that soft power, to influence the decisions of other nations. And there's obviously a big gap, and that gap's driven by historical decisions. And we've never had a good ability in the developing world certainly not compared to the Soviet Union and not compared to China today. And that's a big gap. And I guess you could say maybe it doesn't make a difference because power beyond the military is economic, so much of the economic and military power. But in terms of future economic growth, that's in the developing world. So I feel like, that's a huge gap in U.S. strategy in terms of beating China, outcompeting China.
Yeah, and let's say outcompeting China, because one last thing that I want to say I'm frustrated about the coverage with China is that, again, China does a lot of evil things, but we've talked to, a lot of countries, this isn't equivocating, but to just say that they are simply evil, putting them in the category is more like, we don't say all these other countries are evil because we don't fear their power. Because you're actually challenging power does not mean that you're inherently evil and these other countries doing evil things are not. So I just how evil is China. We just can't put them in that simple, we're good, they are evil kind of categorization, which we want to do so desperately. Too much in the media and too much of the even policy remarks, I think, follows that. And I was saying, we have Trump put all these tariffs on China, and they raised tariffs on us for a trade war that Trump eventually just gave up on. They are ridiculous. Biden made a soft promise to get rid of them, but then they're still there. And Biden at one point said, we're just going to keep them there until we get something from China. But negotiations have never gone anywhere. There's really nothing to this. So, I feel like if we want China to cooperate on these issues like Russia, then instead of just scolding them, don't you dare provide weapons, we could say we're genuinely interested in cooperation on these issues and let's get rid of these tariffs. It's a small gesture, but it allows them, it's a measure of cooperation instead of just trying to a battle of wills. We're putting you in this enemy camp. We say we want to cooperate on China with certain things, but we never act cooperatively or show even a willingness to truly be cooperative when we have sort of things like sanctions that make no sense.
Yeah, and that's why, we talked about it before. It would be interesting to see in that 7-hour conversation that Blinken had with his counterparts in China, or Sullivan, I can't remember who met last week, but whether that came up and whether there was this talk of kind of trading in order to get China, because China arguably is the only one that could have power to make Putin back down short of a maximalist gain of. But
they have to show that they have something in it for cooperation, because they don't want to see we gave in to Western bullying, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's where ending the sanctions would come in.
Because one, we lose nothing really to do it, right? We should have never put them on in the first place. They've accomplished nothing for us.
Yeah. Well, Trump would say, I'm doing this to create leverage. So we do have some leverage now. So we should take advantage of it and try to get something that we want. And we would want China to help in this war.
Yeah. The pushback for China may be this was dumb in the first place. But it becomes a small token that benefits everyone, that literally benefits people in the US, in China, and is, it's more of we're going to cooperate. We're not just going to lecture each other.
Yeah, I think it would potentially be a positive move. And I know there's definitely talk of, can this represent an opportunity to one, break apart kind of that relationship or put, some strain on the Russia-China relationship and try to pull China back into a more positive relationship with the U.S. and the West. But
I do want to say, for better or for worse, this whole dropping the tariffs was my idea. I didn't read it anywhere.
So you can get credit for it if
I want credit for it
because it's out there.
Because it's one of the things I wasn't reading it. I just one day was I'm just going to send us out a tweet. Like, why don't we use this to get rid of these tariffs?
Yep.
Okay. So closing out?
Yep. I think that's the episode.
I think this brings us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kelloggsglobalpolitics.com. And you can follow us on Twitter at Global Kellogg and me at AR Kellogg.
You can also reach us by email, Anita at kelloggglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan, at kelloggglobalpolitics.com. As always, please see the show notes for any of the articles that we discussed today and leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast provider.
Finally, I just want to say that I will probably also post the full interview I did with Dr. Shahin Berenji that I had to limit to put it in this podcast. So be sure to look for that in your feed as well.
Yep, that was a great conversation.
Okay.
All right. Bye everybody.